the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali. It's Wednesday, April 22nd, 2015. After a record-breaking delay, Loretta Lynch's confirmation for Attorney General is likely to come through. Salon writer David Dayen will explain. And activists denounce a dismissal of charges against the cop that killed Rekia Boyd in Chicago. We'll turn to journalist Thandisizwe Chimurenga for more. Plus, how poverty is being criminalized, particularly for people of color. Karen Dolan, author of a new report, will discuss how child support requirements in particular are landing more black men in prison than ever before. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Courtney Morris. She's an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. Hi, Courtney.
Hi, Sonali.
A day after Saudi Arabia had announced that it would suspend airstrikes on Yemen, it resumed bombing the war-torn and impoverished nation that has been taken over by Houthi Shia rebels. This morning, bombs pounded the city of Taiz in the southwestern part of Yemen. The strikes came at the same time as a battle raged on the ground between Houthis and forces loyal to Yemeni President Abdul Rabu Mansour Hadi, who's fled to Saudi Arabia. A local source told the New York Times that, quote, there are many deaths on both sides as a result of this morning's bombing campaign. The Saudis are receiving close logistical support and intelligence from the U.S. Earlier in the week, bombs killed 25 civilians and injured hundreds in the capital, Sana'a. Elsewhere in the Arab world, another war rages on in Syria. Responding to the mass deaths of refugees in the Mediterranean Sea, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants told The Guardian today that rich countries need to take in 1 million Syrian refugees in order to stave off more deaths. Well, Courtney, aren't the US and Saudi Arabia creating yet another horrific situation in Yemen that will only add to the exodus of refugees from the entire region desperate to leave their homes?
Absolutely. I believe that is the case. I mean, when we look at Syria, the refugee situation there has been horrifying. Since the war broke out there in 2011, more than 6.5 million people have been displaced internally in Syria. That's more than half of the civilian population. And 3 million people have fled the country. And the United States, I mean, when people applied for asylum in the United States in 2013, the United States only approved 36 applications for people who were fleeing the war in Syria. And so, you know, I think in the rush to intervene militarily in the region, we've realized that the United States really has failed to meaningfully address the fact that war produces refugees. And when people find themselves living in a war zone where conditions are untenable, they will go wherever they think their chances for survival are strongest. So taking in 1 million refugees from Syria, from other parts of the Middle East and Africa who've been displaced by our policy and economic policy, I think is the least we can do.
The U.S. House of Representatives is expected this morning to pass a bill strengthening cybersecurity, citing the recent breaches at Sony Pictures Entertainment, retail giant Target, and health insurer Anthem. The GOP-dominated House will vote on a cybersecurity bill championed by President Obama and similar to one passed by the Senate Intelligence Committee. Among the provisions in the bill are requirements that private companies give federal investigators access to their computer networks, but concerns about passing on personal information remain. Meanwhile, representatives are also battling over details of the USA Freedom Act, a bill intended to curb some of the worst excesses of the USA Patriot Act that's been used to justify mass surveillance by the NSA. Representative Mike Rogers of the House Intelligence Committee told The Guardian that he was reluctant to curtail surveillance because of the threat posed by the Islamic State to the U.S. Section 215 of the Patriot Act pertaining to NSA surveillance expires on June 1st. Well, Courtney, has the public outcry over mass surveillance seemed to influence Congress at all?
Not as much as one would hope, unfortunately. I mean, I think that the myth that mass surveillance thwarts terrorism and strengthens U.S. national security really continues to hold a lot of traction. Politicians don't want to appear to be weak on national security issues, so they've supported this, even though reports from the NSA, from the CIA, from the Obama administration, and then more recent work by investigative journalists like Glenn Greenwald and think tanks like the New America Foundation all suggest that, in fact, mass surveillance does relatively little to deal with the challenges of terrorist attacks. And so I think fear politics have really driven the debate here. The Obama administration since last year has said repeatedly that an attack on U.S. soil from ISIS is highly unlikely. But these tactics continue to be really effective, and politicians from both sides of the aisle really use them to justify the ongoing erosion of our civil liberties.
And finally, today is the 45th annual Earth Day. Celebrations are taking place all over the world. President Obama is making an appearance at the Everglades National Park in Florida to mark it. Everglades is showing tangible symptoms of climate change because rising concentrations of salt water from a warming climate have impacted wild grass growth and local flora and fauna. Republican presidential candidate and climate denier Florida Governor Rick Scott took the president's visit personally, releasing a statement yesterday criticizing the president for failing to fulfill the Everglades funding needs. Meanwhile, a group of scientists and economists with the Earth League released a joint statement today laying out 8 important issues that need to be addressed at the next UN climate conference in Paris later this year. The letter is available at earthstatement.org. Courtney, do you have an opinion on Earth Day? Shouldn't every day be Earth Day?
I have an opinion on everything, Sonali. I mean, I'm not opposed to Earth Day. I mean, I think it's a symbolic gesture that is positive in that it provides a space for society to reflect on these critical questions regarding the future of the planet. But, you know, the stakes are so high, it seems almost ridiculous to celebrate a single day when these are really life and death issues. This very recently, I watched the Island President documentary, which follows former President Mohammed Nasheed of the Maldives and his efforts to get the international community to acknowledge the ecological crisis facing his country. The Maldives is literally disappearing as a result of rising sea levels caused by man-made climate change. And this, for me, I think is the point that, you know, the economic inequalities in this world are such that some of us have the luxury of thinking about the planet once or twice a year so we can feel good about ourselves, while there are lots of other people who are literally losing their lands and their livelihoods. And so we need more than a holiday. We need real worldwide coordinated effort to deal with the crisis of climate change.
Courtney Morris, we love having your opinions on our program. Thanks so much for joining us.
Bye, Sonali.
Courtney Morris is an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. No other nominee for U.S. Attorney General has had to wait as long as Loretta Lynch has. The 56-year-old New York attorney has been waiting for more than 160 days for Congress to confirm her as a replacement for Eric Holder. In a bizarre move, Senate Republicans earlier this year conditioned her confirmation on an amendment to a sex trafficking bill that was related to abortion expenses. Lynch had nothing whatsoever to do with the trafficking bill other than actually being a strong leader on justice for victims of sex trafficking in her position as an attorney for the state of New York. Democrats accused the Republicans of stalling her confirmation hearing because of Lynch's race and gender, a charge the GOP vehemently denies. My guest is David Dayen, contributing writer to Salon, weekly columnist at the Fiscal Times. Welcome to Uprising, David. David, we had you on our show about a month ago to discuss this bizarre issue. Can you remind us once more what was at stake in the trafficking bill that Democrats and Republicans couldn't agree on? And actually, we're going to try to bring David back on with us as we just dropped his call, or his call just dropped. Again, Loretta Lynch, if confirmed, would be the first African-American female Attorney General. David, are you with us? Can you hear me, David? Well, we will bring David back on the phone with us. David Dayen, a writer with Salon and also a columnist with the Fiscal Times. The issue at stake with the Loretta Lynch confirmation hearing is that it was held up because Republicans decided to condition her confirmation on a sex trafficking bill and a particular amendment in that bill that would have had to do with taxpayer expenses on abortions. And of course, this is always a hot button issue. So it looks like we're going to try to bring David on with us. Can you hear me, David? Unfortunately, he is still unavailable. David, can you hear me now? All right, we're going to bring David on. Do bear with us. We do apologize for the technical problems. It's a live show, and that's what happens. So hopefully we'll have David on very, very soon. Can you hear me now, David?
Yes, I can.
Yay, excellent. Okay, so well, we had you on the show about a month ago to discuss this very bizarre state of affairs in Congress. Can you remind us once more what was at stake in the trafficking bill that Democrats and Republicans couldn't agree on, and why Lynch's nomination got caught in the middle to begin with?
Well, it had to do with the Hyde Amendment. Now, the Hyde Amendment is sort of a principle that was put in by Henry Hyde, a Republican from several years back. And the idea is that under the Hyde Amendment, no federal funds can be used in the for the purposes of abortion.
Right. And actually, David, we'd like to keep your video, so if you could come back to your video, and we'll stay with you on the phone for your
Am I
video.
here?
Yeah.
Can you see me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, very good. So, as I said, the Hyde Amendment was about federal funding. At stake in the sex trafficking bill, there were basically a fund was going to be created for victims of sex trafficking, and that would be paid for with fines from perpetrators, and that money the Republicans wanted to restrict from any use for abortion. So that would extend the principles of the Hyde Amendment to different pots of money, a pot of money that would be paid for out of fines. And Democrats did not want that extension of the Hyde Amendment to go forward. The inevitable compromise here is that no money for health care comes out of fines, but health care comes out of a separate fund paid for by federal funding, and that is restricted under the Hyde Amendment. So it's kind of a symbolic solution. The Hyde Amendment isn't extended to these fines, but it's still the case that victims of sex trafficking with this fund could not use that money to pay for abortion.
How strong a leader has Lynch herself been on this issue? Is there great irony in the GOP holding up her confirmation over this issue?
Well, I'm not sure that that's really what's going on here. I think that Lynch was sort of caught in the middle of an issue that got wrapped up in abortion politics, which, as we know, are very toxic in Washington. And so, I mean, there may be some irony there, as you allude to. I don't think that was sort of an intended irony. It might be an unintended consequence. I think that she was just sort of stuck in the middle, and then Congress finally realized after weeks and weeks of this that they wanted to move forward on some other issues, as particularly Republicans who kind of ran in 2014 on an idea that they were going to come back and govern. So they moved on basically by coming up with some kind of compromise to band-aid this sex trafficking bill so they could move on, get Lynch confirmed, and move forward.
Now, are both parties walking away from this bizarre fight having saved face? I frankly don't see how the GOP has saved face.
Yeah, basically that's what they're trying to do. I mean, the GOP gets what they wanted in terms of the sex trafficking bill, which is no money from it ends up going towards the abortion. Democrats can say that they didn't extend the principles of the Hyde Amendment into this other pot of money, but that's kind of cold comfort, if you ask me. And then Lynch gets confirmed finally after months and months and months, and we'll have to see what she ends up doing in office.
Now, what are the next steps specifically? Is her confirmation all but assured? Is there a date set?
I would say it's all but assured. It could come as early as tomorrow. There are basically they will move once they dispense with the sex trafficking bill to an executive session. There are already enough votes out there that are confirmed, people who have said that they would vote for Lynch to get past what is now just a 51 vote hurdle or a 50 vote hurdle if Vice President Biden breaks the tie. There are enough votes. There are 51 votes for Loretta Lynch in the Senate. That's pretty well confirmed. So it's just a matter of how long it takes to dispense with the confirmation, and that could come as early as tomorrow.
After all has been said and done, David, what do you make of the allegations that Republicans held up her nomination, perhaps partly because she is a black woman? She certainly didn't get the Ashton Carter treatment, who got confirmed right away as Secretary of Defense.
That's certainly true.
I mean, they chose to put her nomination in the middle of this fight rather than his nomination.
It's a true statement. At the same time, Eric Holder is completely loathed by the GOP, and moving forward on Lynch would have gotten him out much more quickly. I think that sometimes things aren't that well planned in Washington. They just sort of grabbed whatever was around as leverage for this particular sex trafficking bill. It's certainly possible. I mean, my issues on the Lynch nomination have more to do with the fact that she was the one who prosecuted or didn't prosecute HSBC,
right,
laundering money for Mexican drug cartels for decades, and got off with nobody going to jail in a non-prosecution agreement, deferred prosecution agreement. And even though they have shown themselves to continue to violate anti-money laundering laws, that deferred prosecution agreement has not resulted in any further prosecution. So that's kind of my issue with Lynch. We'll see how she serves.
And if her confirmation had been held up on that issue, that would have been extremely fair. I mean, we had covered that on our program.
And you're absolutely accurate to say that this was just sort of a shadow play. There was no real reason that was given, like a concrete reason like that, of her closeness to Wall Street. And so you can definitely make the argument that she was caught in the crossfire of a political battle that was unrelated to her
now,
in Washington.
What do you think? I'm wondering if you're able to speculate on what sort of Attorney General she will be compared to Eric Holder. I mean, in the position that he was in, Eric Holder certainly seemed to have done better than any Attorney General in recent memory when it came to certain issues of justice. On other issues, of course, he was much worse. When we're talking about the persecution of journalists and privacy concerns, he was much worse. On the issue of paying lip service to civil rights, he seemed to be better. Do you have any sense of how Loretta Lynch might follow in his footsteps?
Well, I think that there will be a lot of continuity between Loretta Lynch's tenure and Eric Holder's tenure. I think on civil rights issues, I see Lynch having many of the same priorities as Holder. On the lack of prosecutions for Wall Street, I also see a lot of similarities there. I think she's just going to play out these last 2 years much as the first 6 years have gone. In fact, the one sort of thread that was used to hold up Lynch's nomination that was in any way close to being substantive was her support for the president's immigration order, which of course Holder supported as well. In most of these things, I believe the phrase is the Cossacks worked for the Tsar. And, President Obama has certain priorities with respect to the dispensation of justice, and I think Loretta Lynch will fall in line with those.
Well, we'll see how it plays out. Thank you so much, as always, David, for joining us.
Okay, thank you.
My guest, David Dayen, is a contributing writer to Salon and a weekly columnist at the Fiscal Times. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. If you'd like to watch our TV show, tune in to Free Speech TV or subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Your subscription funds the TV production of this program. Despite the spotlight that the Black Lives Matter movement has shown on the police killings of African Americans, cops are still rarely charged. And when they're charged, they're even more rarely prosecuted. When prosecuted, it is almost unheard of for there to be a conviction. The shooting death of a 22-year-old African-American woman named Rekia Boyd in Chicago sadly did not change this entrenched pattern. On Monday, a Chicago County judge abruptly dismissed all charges against Thandisizwe, a police officer who fatally shot Boyd on March 21, 2012. Prosecutors charged Servine with involuntary manslaughter, the first criminal charges brought against an off-duty Chicago cop since Gregory Becker was charged and convicted for the 1995 killing of a homeless man. Not only has Servine escaped prison time, he is expected to return to the force almost immediately. Last December, Chicago police came under fire once more for fatally shooting a black teenager named Laquan McDonald 16 times. That shooting is being investigated by the FBI. The Chicago Police Department has a notorious reputation of corruption and brutality. My guest is Thandisizwe Chimurenga, contributing writer for Truth Out, Counterpunch, and the Los Angeles Watts Times and Sentinel newspapers. She's the author of No Doubt, The Murders of Oscar Grant, as well as the newly released Reparations Not Yet, A Case for Reparations and Why We Must Wait, which is a contribution to the ongoing debate of reparations to African Americans for slavery. Welcome to Uprising, Thandi.
Thank you for having me, Sonali.
Now, you've been covering the trials of officers involved in the shootings of black women like Rekia Boyd, but also Renisha McBride and others. Were you in any way surprised by this outcome?
Well, the surprise for me was that it happened so quickly. I knew the trial had started, but, so much has been going on. I was not paying attention to it on a daily basis the way I normally would have. And so what I found out is that Officer Servine opted for a bench trial going before the judge and not having a jury trial. So the fact that the verdict came in so quickly, it was dismissed, is what was surprising to me. But the fact that Servine got off, no, that didn't surprise me at all.
Now, what was really bizarre was that the judge dismissed charges of involuntary manslaughter because that requires evidence of recklessness. He described the act of shooting as intentional, and he said if it's intentional, and the crime, if there be any, is first-degree murder. So, again, this sounds as though it was dropped on a technicality.
Well, according to this judge, the statutes in Illinois, in his words, as reflected in the media, have consistently ruled that if you point a gun and shoot it, you're doing something intentionally and it is beyond reckless. Therefore, in the wording of the law, it should be first-degree murder. The prosecutor did not charge first-degree murder. They charged involuntary manslaughter. Usually, prosecutors overcharge. They'll charge something like a first-degree murder and a lesser charge, kind of like a catch-all. That didn't happen in this case. And so I think that one of the things we have to look at is the role of prosecutors when it comes to going to these quote-unquote justice systems seeking redress for black lives.
Now, in this case, there was a black man involved that the police shooter, Thandisizwe, says he felt threatened by. Antonio Cross, who was with Rekia Boyd at the time of the shooting. Antonio was unarmed. He had a cell phone, but no gun. And Servine just shot over his shoulder. He shot Cross in the thumb. Cross did survive, but his bullets also hit Rekia Boyd, and she died. I mean, it's just incredible that the judge would dismiss these additional charges of reckless discharge of a firearm and reckless conduct. He shot over his shoulder. He was off duty. Didn't he recklessly endanger people's lives when he shot his gun?
If you're saying that he shot over his shoulder, and I believe he may have even been in the car, I mean, it's almost incredulous. What are you talking about? He wasn't even looking and aiming. He's just shooting almost wildly with absolutely no regard whatsoever for this crowd of people he's shooting in. So where is the redress for that? My understanding is he's unable to be tried again on a different charge because of double jeopardy. So once again, you have the situation where the black public, not the public, but the black public's safety is being disregarded by this person who we're told is supposed to protect and serve. There is no protect and serve when it comes to the black public.
And he is expected to return to the force? He's not even losing his job?
Well, again, there's no regard for the black public safety. He's had a 3-year vacation, been able to do whatever he wanted to do, fly fishing, hanging out on Lake Michigan. I don't know what he's been doing. And now he's going to go back to work. He's going to be, again, in contact with the black public. So what can you say?
Now, it's amazing because, of course, the Chicago Police Department could take its own position and at least, even if he doesn't face prison time, if the judge said there should have been a first-degree murder charge, the Chicago Police Department could have had their own conclusion and said what he did was indeed reckless. At the very least, he's going to lose his job. That didn't happen, but that says a lot about the Chicago Police Department in general. I mentioned the earlier shooting last December of the teenage boy, Laquan McDonald, 16 times. What do you make of the police department as a whole? I mean, federal investigators are looking into Laquan McDonald's shooting, but shouldn't Chicago be getting the Ferguson treatment, at least in terms of scrutiny?
Well, I mean, not to pick on Chicago, but I mean, this is the place where they officially tortured black men.
Yes.
This is the place where they had, quote unquote, this black site for taking people to torture them. So, I mean,
now, and so what is the message that the Chicago police are sending to Chicagoans, both black and non-black, by putting this man back on the force?
That it's okay to kill black people. Yeah. And in this instance, that's who was killed. It's quite possible that it's okay to kill anyone as a police officer, but we are clear that the message now is it's okay to kill black people and get away with it, as has been the policy of most police departments.
Now, Rekia Boyd's family was paid a $4.5 million settlement by the city. I mean, they obviously, that in itself is an admission that what was done to her was wrong. Do you see this payment as any kind of justice?
How could it possibly be any amount of justice? First of all, their daughter, their sister, their cousin, their niece, their granddaughter has been taken in a most horrendous manner. The person responsible for that will face absolutely no type of accountability, no type of punishment, no type of justice. But if we even take Rekia Boyd's family out of it for just a moment, we're told that these types of lawsuits are settled because it's less expensive than going to trial. $4.5 million, how much does it cost to go to a trial? That's money that could be going towards some of those schools that Rahm Emanuel has closed throughout the city of Chicago. So it's a lose-lose situation all around, unless, of course, your police officers, predominantly white police officers, and their families.
And in this...
also, Sonali, real quick, I just wanted to correct you. At the beginning, you talked about my coverage of different cases. Renisha McBride in Detroit, she was not killed physically by a police officer. She was killed by an individual, a homeowner.
And I'm glad you brought up Renisha McBride because it's interesting to see how the killings of black women are not getting as much attention as we're finally seeing for the killings of black men. Do you feel that this is something that really needs extra attention by the press?
Oh, most definitely. I think that part of the problem is that because the United States is a patriarchal white supremacist state, the focus is usually on black men as the threat. Black men are constantly under surveillance. The entire black community is, but usually there's a focusing or zeroing in on men because of the whole issue of patriarchy, viewing men as threats and men as being most important. But what we as people who understand, not only in the black community, but as people on the left, people in the alternative and independent media must understand, is that focusing on such a single gender narrative, it does a disservice to the overall struggle for accountability and justice and against police terror. So because of the way that technology is, we're seeing and hearing more about these police crimes, which is a good thing, but we've got to also understand that black women are not safe, black children are not safe. Ayanna Jones was 7, Tamir Rice was 12. So the entire black community is under threat because of police crimes.
I think it's also important for us all to acknowledge that black women have been the force behind the Black Lives Matter movement. How important is that?
Well, I think that black women have been in the forefront and have been the backbone of many, many movements. I think the difference now with Black Lives Matter is that you have in the founders, Opal Ayo, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors-Brignac, a determination made early on. We're letting you know that we are the backbone of this, that we have initiated this in concert with others. We're not going to just labor in the background and not say anything. We're going to do the work, but we're not going to allow you to erase us and make us invisible. We're doing the work, and we want you to know that we're doing the work.
Thandi, on our show yesterday, we discussed the case of Freddie Gray in Baltimore, and that's an ongoing story. There are protests, more protests today in Baltimore, and we talked about the trauma that family members of those killed suffer. Rekia Boyd's brother, Martinez Sutton, just had this emotional outburst in the court when the charges were dismissed, and later talked to the press. How important is it for us to recognize this sort of double trauma that families go through, first when their loved ones are killed and then when the killers are exonerated?
Well, it's traumatic all the way around. Partly, I call it the soul murder of a community. You know, what happens when the person is first killed. And in the case of many, it didn't happen in Rekia's instance, to my knowledge, but in the case of many of these victims of police murder, they'll be murdered again by the courts, and they'll be murdered again by the media. And all of this affects the communities from which they come, the families from which they come. So it's definitely a traumatizing and a re-traumatizing of our communities, which is why it is important that there be a movement against this type of activity, this type of terroristic activity on behalf of the police. It's about Rekia Boyd, but it's not about Rekia Boyd. It's about Mike Brown, but it's not about Mike Brown, and so forth and so on. All of these individuals have been taken from us collectively, and from the black community's perspective, we all know it could have very well been us or someone that we love. So.
Finally, Thandi, we had brought up the case of Renisha McBride earlier, and if anything, that might bear more similarity to the Trayvon Martin shooting, a young person who was killed by, a gun owner, essentially. She was a very, very young, she was a teenager. She knocked on the door of a white man's home. She was shot, and the case came down last year. You'd been covering that very specifically. Can you give our listeners a brief recap of that case and whether that can be a model for pursuing justice in other cases, particularly where police might be concerned, if there's any overlap with a police killing?
Well, Renisha McBride had been in a car accident. She was under the influence of a couple of substances, and in the ensuing car crash, she also may have suffered a closed head injury. So she was, as we say, having some issues. She knocked on the door of a home around 4:30 in the morning, and the homeowner, Ted Wafer, went to the door with a 12-gauge shotgun and discharged it, hitting her in the face and killing her. And so this issue, similar to what happened with Jordan Davis in Florida. You look at the George Zimmerman case, the difference being is that George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin's killing, George Zimmerman had a proximity to law enforcement and to the legal system that basically kind of shielded him. The murder of Jordan Davis and Ted Wafer, they didn't have that same type of proximity. They were found guilty of that particular murder. So in terms of what happened in the case of Renisha McBride, you had a prosecutor there who is known for aggressively going after not only police, but as you can see, homeowners, individuals. This is what we need in terms of a prosecutor, but we don't have it in many cities.
Well, so an aggressive prosecutor is what's needed and can make the difference. I want to thank you so much, Thandi, for joining us today. I'll let you go and answer that door. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Sonali.
My guest is Thandisizwe Chimurenga. She is a journalist who is a contributing writer for for a number of organizations, including Truth Out, Counterpunch, and the Los Angeles Times, as well as the Sentinel newspaper. She's the author of No Doubt, The Murders of Oscar Grant. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. 50-year-old Walter Scott had been having money problems. The African-American father of 4 who was gunned down in the back by white North Carolina officer Michael Slager owed more than $18,000 in child support payments. He had already been imprisoned once for being unable to make payments. The Charleston family court had issued a warrant for his arrest, and it might have been the thought of that warrant that crossed Scott's mind when Slager pulled him over for a broken brake light. Scott probably feared he would wind up in prison once more and fled. Not only was Scott's death at the hands of Slager emblematic of the decades-long problem of police shootings of unarmed people of color, but poverty in the black community also figured into the equation. A majority of unpaid child support nationwide is owed by poor parents of color, most of them estimated to be poor black men. The Institute for Policy Studies recently released a report on this and related phenomenon called The Poor Get Prison, the alarming spread of the criminalization of poverty. Joining us to discuss the report is Karen Dolan. She's a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, where she directs the Criminalization of Poverty project. She also assists the Economic Hardship Reporting Project and is the lead author of the report that was just released. Welcome to Uprising, Karen.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, we remember the racist stereotype of the 1980s aimed at black women, the welfare queen, but there was a male stereotype too, and that was the deadbeat dad. How has this stereotype fed the system of fines and prison sentencing facing poor fathers so that they're often thrown into prison for not having the money to pay child support?
Well, that's just a part of the increase in fining and threatening people with arrest and, in fact, incarcerating people for something no more than debt, which is not legal in this country. But with child support, we do have a little bit of a different system than with some of the other traffic violations that we've seen a big increase in. And we have a system that really was designed to catch middle-class fathers or non-custodial parents who were hiding assets. But of course, it's come to adversely affect people who are too poor to afford the amount in the first place. So we've got an extra special problem with child support when it comes to non-custodial parents and their ability to pay.
Well, the U.S. abolished debtors' prisons more than 100 years ago, or about 100 years ago. Doesn't Walter Scott's prison time for failing to pay child support essentially amount to debtors' prison?
Well, yes, it does. And it really points to the way in which child support needs to be, the way in which child support is enforced needs to be changed. As I said, it was sort of originally constructed in this way so that people who had the ability to pay but were somehow hiding their assets, and there would be an ability to pay hearing that would determine that. And there were processes put in place like imputing income. So if somebody didn't have a job, well, they didn't have a job, the presumption was because they didn't want to have enough income so that their child support obligation would be higher. But it turns out that in cases and in areas of high unemployment, of people who in the first place don't have the ability to pay, who then may have their driver's license or their professional license revoked, or the original obligation is too high that they can't take care of the rest of their needs, or sometimes they're incarcerated, they lose their jobs, or in the wake of the recession when unemployment was so high, especially for Black men and for people in very impoverished areas. So the child support enforcement mechanisms do not take this into account.
Now, at what point did there stop being these hearings? I mean, you cite some cases in your report where a person who might not have had the money up front to pay off a particular fine, not necessarily a child support fine, that rather than allow them to continue working to pay off the fine, a judge might actually put them in prison, which would result in the loss of a job and the inability to pay the fine. And that might be happening in the case of child support payments as well. Are judges, by the act of imprisoning people who owe child support, actually cutting off the child support altogether?
Yes, so that is a result of this kind of aggressive following of this kind of debt. And it's not just with the child support, but with any of these fines and fees, whether it's child support, whether it's a traffic violation, whether it's a speeding ticket, another low-level offense. We aren't supposed to be jailed for an inability to pay. We aren't supposed to be jailed for owing debt. And that has the policing around that in traffic violations and other misdemeanor offenses. It's a little different from the child support case. But in this sort of really growing trend of capturing people for traffic violations and misdemeanor offenses and threatening them with arrest and or, in fact, jailing them without an inability to pay hearing has been something that's been on the increase, especially since the recession, especially since we've seen state budgets and local budgets, municipal budgets, court budgets squeezed. In order to make up that deficit, we've seen more aggressive policing and court actions that not only increase fines and fees, but are very aggressive about issuing arrest warrants and incarcerating, skipping over the protections that we should be legally afforded.
How are these skipping over actions legal? I mean, how is it that these inability to pay hearings are being bypassed?
Well, they're not legal. And so when you have, so the ACLU has done a really good job in trying to expose where this is happening, and the Department of Justice as well. So if you look at the Department of Justice recent investigation into Ferguson, you can see massive violations against people's 14th Amendment rights to due process, and they point out just this sort of thing. So this happens, and if you are a person who is indigent or poor without means, you don't have a lawyer all the time with you. You don't know your rights. You don't know that you can't be thrown in jail for debt. Sometimes the ACLU has found in some places that the inability to hearing the ability to pay hearing has been skipped over, or a judge does a summary judgment based on how somebody looks, what they're wearing, things that wouldn't count as a real ability to pay hearing. So there are lots of ways in which the child support case in particular, where those rules have to be overhauled. They're a little bit different from some of these other ways in which poor people are getting caught through fines and fees.
Now, I understand one of the things that you point out in your report that really shocked me is that when mothers are on government assistance, their estranged male partners might be required to pay back the government the cost of that assistance, such as Medicare or Medicaid. How does that happen? How is that legal?
Well, that is the way some of the child support enforcement was written, for the states to be able to recoup that benefit assistance from the non-custodial parent. But again, and these are different from what the report was focusing on. Fines and fees and these misdemeanors, that the way in which they're prosecuted is illegal. What needs to happen with the child support enforcement mechanisms is that they need to be rewritten, and there needs to be more attention paid to the actual income, not the imputed income of the non-custodial parent. There needs to be a provision that the non-custodial parent has enough for their own subsistence needs when this is when the state takes the reimbursement out of the child support, that the money is not kept by the state, that it's passed through to the custodial parent, and only then can any reimbursement for the meager welfare assistance be recouped by the state. So the focus of child support enforcement is supposed to be on the well-being of the child. But if we're not looking at the subsistence needs of the custodial parent through need for welfare assistance, and or the non-custodial parent who must be able to take care of their basic needs in order to be able to provide for that child, then those mechanisms are not effective in taking care of the well-being of the child.
One news article on the Walter Scott case cited that when a judge was essentially letting him know that he had to somehow come up with child support payments even though he couldn't find a job, and he said, well, how am I supposed to support myself? The judge replied something to the effect of, well, that's your problem. And so I'm wondering, Karen, if you can step back and address the broader issue, which, of course, children, child support is important. The single mothers need the support that that they might not get when the fathers are out of the picture. But isn't the broader issue poverty in general, right? Poverty for both parents, poverty that children are experiencing, that instead of holding poor people so harshly accountable, that government needs to be doing more, and we as a society need to be doing better about addressing poverty from the ground up.
That's right. That's exactly right. So that is the point. So with poverty so widespread across this country, and with the increase and uptick in poverty since the recession, at the same time that there was an increase in unemployment, and then at the same time that state budgets and local budgets came out with budget deficits, and courts and police were put in the service of recouping that money off the backs of poor people, because where these budget deficits were the greatest are in poor communities where they don't have high property taxes to bolster those budgets. That's where you really have the problem, and that if we can't address this growing inequality in our country, the fact that a person can work full-time and minimum wage and not have enough to sustain their family, then we're going to see the problem of child support is not going to be fixed by taking a poor non-custodial parent and taking away his or her license or ability to get to a job, or throwing them in jail so that they lose their job, which is what happened to Walter Scott.
And what needs to specifically be done in terms of the very complex web of fines and fines for simple traffic violations that your report focused on? The Justice Department's report on Ferguson showed this clear pattern of how ordinary and poor people are squeezed to fund the court system. Do we have a system of Fergusons all over the country? And if so, how do we start reforming that?
We do have a system of Fergusons all over the country. Wherever you find high poverty and low income areas, you have these problems. And there was an investigation by NPR in 2014 that showed that there was an increase in this nationwide in these fines and fees. And so you get people caught in a vicious cycle. And this is neither legal nor is it found sound fiscal policy. So this isn't something that's sustainable on any level. So we've got to really enforce these ability to pay hearings. That has to happen before an arrest warrant is issued, never mind before somebody is thrown in jail. There has to be modifications for the way in which child support enforcement is carried out and take into account that who it's most adversely affecting are poor people. All of these punitive disciplinary measures and aggressive policing and targeting are aimed at and most adversely affect poor people. And then within that demographic, it's poor Black people that are most profiled. So racial profiling added on top of the criminalization of the poor results in some of these very violent police encounters that we've seen so much of recently, although they've been going on for a long time.
Right, and so it's a system that right from the moment of the encounter with police all the way to where someone lands in prison or loses their job is designed to further impoverish people and criminalize them for being impoverished. Do you think that ultimately the legal issue of what is amounting to debtor's prison might end up at, in court, maybe even at the Supreme Court, that we may start addressing the fact that even though we've outlawed debtors' prisons, they're essentially being illegally, making a comeback?
Well, this was relitigated in 1983. So debtors' prisons were eliminated almost 200 years ago in the United States. And in 1983, the Supreme Court did hear a case, Bearden versus Georgia. And it was just on this case of a young man who had been imprisoned for $750 in a burglary, and for various reasons, and hadn't finished high school and was illiterate and didn't have a job and borrowed part of the money to pay back the fee, but wasn't able to get all of the money in the time specified and ended up spending years in jail and fines and fees just increasing. And so that was heard by the Supreme Court in 1983 and it was very strongly decided. Again, debtors' prisons are illegal and the ability to pay hearings must happen. So it has been relitigated. I think we need more of the Justice Department involvement as it was in Ferguson, and now apparently will be looking into, it's a different kind of case with police brutality, but we don't know the circumstances behind it, but they'll be looking into the death of Freddie Price in Baltimore.
Freddie Gray, yeah.
Gray, in Baltimore.
Now, has the criminalization of poverty become a bit more visible, you think, these days, Karen? The Ferguson report by the DOJ probably helped. And then there was a pretty good New York Times article this week that was entitled, "Skip Child Support, Go to Jail, Lose Job, Repeat." That was the very catchy headline that I think summed up very well this cycle that people are trapped in. Are we seeing more media coverage and better media coverage eventually, many years too late, perhaps?
I think we are. I think we have seen places like the ACLU, the Brennan Center for Justice, that great NPR investigation has really started to shine a light on some of these issues. And the criminalization of homelessness has made some really high-profile media of people being arrested for feeding the homeless and increase across the country in just human functions being criminalized by people who can't afford to be housed. And since the recession, I think as we saw saw a growing poverty rate, and we've had a lot of attention thanks to the 99% movement in the way in which our country has become increasingly unequal. So we see more concentrations of poverty and more concentrations of wealth. And in the areas with high poverty, there's been some attention to what's happening. But when you now have social media and we have these horrific videos coming from events that stem from something like a broken taillight or child support debt, and that it results in death and in beatings, and we can see sort of exposed what is this tinderbox underneath this police violence that is really creating the circumstances when you bring together racial profiling, poverty, fear, and this kind of social control and aggressive policing. You have this perfect storm for what we've seen on these videos.
And it's no wonder that Walter Scott and Freddie Gray ran when they see the police. I mean, what is in store for them if they are caught? And certainly as they are being chased is the ultimate price that they were forced to pay. I want to thank you so much for joining us, Karen. Where can listeners and viewers get a hold of the report, The Poor Get Prison?
Yes, thanks. It's on our Institute for Policy Studies website. That's ips-dc.org.
And we'll post that to uprisingwithsonali.com later today, ips-dc.org. Karen, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
My guest, Karen Dolan, is a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, where she directs the Criminalization of Poverty project. And she is the lead author of the report, The Poor Get Prison: The Alarming Spread of the Criminalization of Poverty. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Corinne Gaston is our research intern. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Federico Garcia is our audio engineer. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprisingwithsonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kohatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.